I walked through the front door of Mom's house, still in my desert camouflage uniform, the acceptance letter from State University clutched in my sweaty palm. After 18 months deployed in Afghanistan, all I wanted was to hug my mother and share the news that would change everything. I had been accepted into their engineering program, and with my GI Bill benefits and the $8,500 I had saved from my deployment pay, college was finally within reach. But when I saw her sitting at the kitchen table with Brad, her new husband of 3 months, both of them surrounded by glossy brochures for luxury cruises and timeshare properties, my stomach dropped. The college fund passbook I had left in her, Care, the one containing every penny I had scraped together during my 2 years of active duty, was sitting open between them. Empty. "Maya, honey, you're home early," Mom said, her voice artificially bright as she quickly shuffled the brochures into a pile. Brad didn't even look up from his phone, where he was scrolling through pictures of motorcycles with price tags that made my head spin. The silence stretched between us like a minefield, and I could feel my training kicking in, that hyper-awareness that had kept me alive overseas. Something was very, very wrong. "Where's my money, Mom?" The words came out steadier than I felt, but my hands were shaking as I set down my duffel bag. The acceptance letter crinkled in my grip, and for a moment I wondered if this was all some kind of nightmare brought on by deployment stress. Maybe I was still in my bunk in Kandahar, dreaming of coming home to betrayal instead of celebration. Mom's face went pale, and she exchanged a quick glance with Brad, who finally looked up from his phone with an expression of mild annoyance, as if my question was interrupting something important. "Well, sweetheart, Brad and I needed to make some investments in our future together," she said, reaching for my hand across the table. I pulled back instinctively, the same way I'd learned to pull back from suspicious objects that might explode. "Investments?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, that was my college fund. That was $8,500 I saved while people were shooting at me." The acceptance letter in my hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, suddenly meaningless without the financial foundation I had spent 2 years building, one careful deposit at a time. Brad finally spoke up, his voice carrying the entitled tone of a man who had never worked for anything in his life. "Look, kid, your mom and I are building something here. We bought into this timeshare in Florida, and I put a down payment on a Harley that's going to appreciate in value. Sometimes you have to spend money to make money." He gestured vaguely at the brochures, as if a vacation property and a motorcycle were somehow equivalent to my education, my future, my dreams. I stared at him, this man who had walked into our lives 6 months ago with his sales pitch charm and his promises to take care of my mother. He was wearing a gold chain that probably cost more than my monthly combat pay, and his teeth were too white, too perfect, like everything else about him. "You spent my deployment savings on a vacation house and a motorcycle?" "Now, Maya, don't." "Be dramatic," Mom said, but her voice was shaking now too. "Brad says the timeshare will pay for itself within 5 years, and then we'll have a steady income stream. We can help you with college later, once the investments start paying off." She was using the same tone she'd used when I was 8, and she'd promised me we'd get a dog someday, the same tone that meant never. I looked around the kitchen where I had spent my childhood, where I had studied for the SATs at this same table, where I had filled out my enlistment papers because college seemed impossible without help. The walls were covered with pictures of my military graduation, my deployment photos, medals and certificates from my service. But now there were new additions: Brad's motorcycle magazines, his golf trophies, pictures of him and Mom at restaurants I could never afford on a soldier's salary. "I trusted you," I said quietly, and the words felt like they were being torn from somewhere deep in my chest. "I gave you power of attorney over that account because I thought you understood what it meant to me. I thought you knew that money represented every night I went to sleep wondering if I'd wake up, every patrol where I held my breath, every letter I wrote to you thinking it might be my last." Mom's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration, of a woman who had been caught and didn't like being held accountable. "You don't understand what it was like while you were gone," she said, her voice rising. "I was lonely. I was scared. And Brad came along and offered me a chance at happiness. We deserve this, Maya. I deserve this after everything I've been through." Brad nodded, as if my mother's loneliness justified stealing my future. "Your mom's been through a lot, and she needs someone to take care of her. That's what real men do, kid. We provide." The way he said kid made my skin crawl, a dismissive term meant to put me in my place, to remind me that despite my service, despite my sacrifice, I was still just a child in his eyes. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. The same feeling I'd had when I realized that some people would never see me as anything more than expendable. In the military, at least the people using me were honest about it. Here, in my childhood home, the betrayal was wrapped in words like love and investment and family. The acceptance letter in my hand had become damp with sweat, the ink beginning to smear. State University's engineering program, the program I had dreamed about through sandstorms and rocket attacks, through 18 months of counting down days until I could come home and build something better. Now it felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of how naive I had been to trust anyone with my future. But as I stood there, watching my mother and her new husband avoid my eyes, I felt something else beneath the betrayal and rage. A familiar feeling from my military training, the moment when chaos gives way to clarity, when shock transforms into strategy. They had taken my money, but they hadn't taken my determination. They had stolen my college fund, but they couldn't steal my ability to fight back. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that I had learned more than just how to follow orders during my service. I had learned how to survive, how to adapt, and how to turn disadvantage into victory. They thought they had won by taking my money, but they had no idea what they had really done. They had just declared war on someone who had been trained to win. Growing up, I had always been the reliable one in our house, the daughter who never caused problems, never asked for much, and always found a way to make things work. While other kids threw tantrums when they didn't get their way, I learned early that keeping the peace meant keeping quiet about my own needs. Mom was a single mother working 2 jobs, and I understood from a young age that every dollar was precious. Every demand I made was another burden on her already strained shoulders. When I was 12, I wanted to join the robotics club at school, but the participation fee was $50. I watched Mom's face when I mentioned it, saw the way her shoulders slumped as she calculated bills in her head, and I quickly told her it didn't matter, that I had changed my mind. Instead, I spent my afternoons at the library checking out books about engineering and programming, teaching myself what I couldn't afford to learn in a structured program. That became my pattern. Want something, realize we couldn't afford it, find another way, never complain. In high school, when my friends were getting cars for their 16th birthdays, I was walking 3 miles to my part-time job at a grocery store, saving every penny for a future that seemed impossibly distant. While they were going to movies and shopping at the mall, I was studying by the light of my phone when our electricity got shut off, determined that education would be my way out of the cycle of financial struggle that had defined our lives. Remember the night Mom sat me down at this same kitchen table during my senior year, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. The college acceptance letters were scattered in front of us, each one representing a dream that felt more like a taunt. "Maya, I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with exhaustion. "But honey, I just don't see how we can make this work. The scholarships you got are amazing, but they don't cover everything, and I can't take on more debt." That was when I made the decision that would change everything. I had been researching military service for months, not because I had some burning desire to be a soldier, but because it was the only path I could see toward the education I wanted. The Army recruiter had explained the GI Bill benefits, the steady pay, the opportunity to save money while serving my country. It wasn't the college experience I had dreamed of, but it was a college experience I could afford. Mom cried when I told her I was enlisting. She held me tight and whispered apologies into my hair, saying she felt like she had failed me, that she should have been able to give me the opportunities other parents gave their children. I assured her it was my choice, that I was proud to serve, that this was just a different route to the same destination. What I didn't tell her was how scared I was, how the thought of leaving everything familiar behind made my stomach churn with anxiety. The decision became even harder when I met Brad 3 months before my deployment. He had swept into Mom's life like a whirlwind, showering her with attention and gifts she had never been able to afford. Expensive dinners, weekend, trips, jewelry that sparkled more than anything she had ever owned. For the first time in years, I saw my mother smile without the weight of worry behind her eyes. She looked younger, happier, more alive than she had since my father left when I was 5. "He makes me feel special, Maya," she told me one evening, as she showed off a new bracelet Brad had given her. I forgot what it was like to have someone take care of me instead of the other way around. I was happy for her, genuinely happy, even as a small voice in the back of my mind wondered what someone like Brad saw in a woman who worked double shifts at a diner and lived in a rental house with peeling paint. During my deployment, Brad's presence in our lives became more and more apparent through Mom's letters and video calls. He was always there in the background, offering suggestions, making plans, talking about their future together. Mom would gush about the places he wanted to take her, the life he was promising, the security he represented. "He says he wants to take care of me forever, Maya," she said during one of our calls, her face glowing with happiness I hadn't seen in years. I was genuinely glad she had found someone who made her happy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Brad. The few conversations I had with him during video calls felt performative, like he was playing the role of the caring stepfather rather than actually caring. He would ask about my service in a way that felt obligatory, and his eyes always seemed to be looking at something else, even when he was talking directly to me. Still, I pushed those doubts aside because Mom seemed so content. For the first time in my life, she wasn't worrying about money constantly. Brad paid for dinners, bought her clothes, took her on weekend getaways to places she had only ever seen in magazines. When they got married in a small ceremony while I was overseas, I felt a pang of sadness that I couldn't be there, but also relief that Mom finally had the stability she deserved. What I didn't realize was that Brad's generosity came with strings, attached, expectations that weren't immediately apparent. He began making decisions about their finances, suggesting investments and purchases that would benefit their future together. He talked about building wealth, about taking risks that would pay off in the long run, about how military families like ours were too conservative with money. The first red flag should have been when Mom mentioned that Brad thought my college fund was sitting there doing nothing when it could be working for the family. She laughed when she told me about his suggestion to invest some of it in a business opportunity he had heard about, as if it was just another one of his quirky ideas. I reminded her firmly that the money was specifically for my education, that every dollar represented sacrifice and careful planning. "Of course, honey," she assured me. "Brad understands that. He's just thinking about ways to help us all do better." But even through the pixelated video call, I could see something in her eyes that made me uneasy, a defensiveness that hadn't been there before. She was already choosing him over me, even if she didn't realize it yet. Looking back now, I could see how carefully Brad had orchestrated everything. He had positioned himself as the provider, the one who brought stability and security to Mom's life. In contrast, I was the daughter who was far away, who had chosen military service over staying home, who had left her to face her loneliness alone. He made sure Mom felt like she owed him something, like his presence in her life was a gift that required gratitude and loyalty. The pattern had been there all along. I just hadn't recognized it for what it was. Brad wasn't just marrying my mother. He was acquiring access to everything that came with her, including the college fund I had entrusted to her care. He had been planning this betrayal from the moment he learned about the money, and Mom had been too grateful for his attention to see the manipulation happening right in front of her. The weeks following that devastating conversation in the kitchen felt like living in a fog of disbelief. I kept replaying the moment over and over, searching for some detail I had missed, some explanation that would make their betrayal less absolute. Maybe I had misunderstood the numbers. Maybe there was another account I didn't know about. Maybe this was all some terrible mistake that could be fixed with a simple phone call to the bank. But every time I checked my banking app, the reality stared back at me in stark black and white. Zero balance. $8,500. Gone. 2 years of careful saving, of choosing the mess hall over restaurants, of sending most of my combat pay home instead of spending it on the small luxuries that made deployment bearable. Every sacrifice I had made, every dollar I had earned while dodging roadside bombs and mortar attacks, had been transformed into Brad's motorcycle and Mom's timeshare fantasy. I started noticing things I had been too shocked to process during that first confrontation. The way Mom wouldn't look directly at me when she talked about their investments. The casual way Brad dismissed my questions about specifics, waving his hand as if details were beneath someone of his obvious business acumen. The brochures spread across the table weren't just travel advertisements, they were evidence of a spending spree funded by my future. During my second week home, I found myself walking through the house like a detective, seeing everything through new eyes. Brad's presence was everywhere now, his belongings integrated seamlessly into the space that had once been just Mom's and mine. His expensive golf clubs leaned against the wall in the hallway. His collection of vintage whiskey bottles lined the kitchen counter. His leather jacket, which probably cost more than I made in a month, hung casually on the back of Mom's chair. Most telling were the receipts I found scattered in Mom's purse when she asked me to grab her car keys. Jewelry stores, high-end restaurants, a spa weekend that cost more than my entire deployment wardrobe. Each receipt was dated within the past 3 months, a timeline that coincided perfectly with Brad's access to my college fund. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had celebrated with it. The realization hit me like a physical blow when I found the motorcycle registration papers tucked inside one of Mom's romance novels. Brad's Harley-Davidson, the one he claimed would appreciate in value, had been purchased with a down payment of exactly $3,000. $3,000 that had come from nights I spent on guard duty in 120-degree heat, from meals I skipped to save money, from care packages I never bought myself because every dollar was earmarked for my education. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. The deeper I looked, the clearer the pattern became. This hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment decision or a temporary lapse in judgment. This had been a calculated plan, executed while I was thousands of miles away and unable to protect what was mine. Brad had identified an opportunity and convinced Mom to betray her own daughter to fund his lifestyle. I began to understand how he had done it, the psychological manipulation that had led my mother to believe that stealing from me was somehow justified. During our video calls, he had always positioned himself as the provider, the one bringing stability and security to her life. He had made her feel like she deserved luxury after years of struggle, that denying herself beautiful things was a form of self-punishment she no longer needed to endure. More insidiously, he had gradually shifted her perspective on my money. In his narrative, the college fund wasn't my hard-earned savings. It was a family resource that should be used for family benefit. He had convinced her that my deployment pay was somehow windfall money, easy money that I could afford to share. He made my military service sound like a vacation where I was getting paid to see the world rather than the dangerous, difficult work it actually was. The manipulation had been so subtle that Mom probably didn't even recognize it as manipulation. Brad had a way of presenting his desires as logical conclusions, his wants as obvious needs. When he suggested they deserved a vacation after Mom's years of hardship, It sounded reasonable. When he pointed out that the timeshare would provide future income, it sounded like smart financial planning. When he mentioned that my college fund was just sitting in an account earning minimal interest, it sounded wasteful not to put it to better use. I could see how each conversation had built on the last, how Brad had gradually worn down Mom's resistance to the idea of using my money. He had probably started by suggesting they borrow just a small amount, promising to pay it back before I returned from deployment. Then it became a slightly larger amount for a better investment opportunity. Finally, it became the entire balance because, in his twisted logic, family members should support each other's dreams, and his dreams apparently mattered more than mine. The most painful realization was that Mom had actively participated in covering up their spending. She had continued our video calls without ever mentioning the timeshare purchase or Brad's motorcycle. She had listened to me talk about my plans for college, my excitement about using my savings to start my engineering program, without once hinting that the money was already gone. She had let me build my hopes higher and higher, knowing the entire time that she was going to shatter them the moment I came home. During one particularly sleepless night, I found myself going through old emails and text messages, looking for clues I had missed. There they were, subtle hints that I had been too trusting to recognize. Mom's sudden reluctance to discuss specific details about my college fund, her vague responses when I asked about the account balance, her new habit of changing the subject whenever I brought up my post-deployment plans. Even more telling were the changes in her vocabulary. She had started using Brad's business jargon, talking about opportunities and investments and building wealth. She had begun to echo his dismissive attitude toward traditional savings, his belief that keeping money in a simple savings account was financially naive. Without realizing it, she had started to see my careful, conservative approach to money management through his eyes, as the perspective of someone too young and inexperienced to understand how wealth really worked. The final piece of the puzzle came when I found a notebook tucked behind Mom's jewelry box, filled with calculations in Brad's handwriting. He had mapped out their spending plan months in advance, allocating my money to specific purchases and investments. The motorcycle down payment, the timeshare fees, the vacation expenses, even the jewelry he had bought for Mom. It was all planned, all budgeted, all based on money that belonged to me. Looking at those calculations, written in Brad's confident scrawl, I realized this wasn't just theft. This was something far more personal and cruel. This was a man who had looked at my military service, my sacrifice, my carefully saved dreams, and decided they were worth less than his desire for luxury toys and vacation properties. He hadn't just stolen my money, he had stolen it with contempt, with the absolute certainty that I was powerless to stop him. The moment of clarity came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after my return home. I was sitting on my childhood bed, surrounded by the remnants of my military life, folded uniforms, deployment photos, letters from fellow soldiers, when I heard Mom and Brad laughing in the kitchen. They were looking at brochures for another vacation, this time to Vegas, planning their next adventure while I struggled to figure out how to afford textbooks for classes I could no longer take. Something inside me snapped, but not in the way I expected. There was no explosion of anger, no dramatic confrontation brewing in my chest. Instead, there was a cold, crystalline moment of understanding that cut through all the confusion and hurt I had been carrying. This wasn't going to change. They weren't going to suddenly realize what they had done and make it right. Mom wasn't going to transform back into the woman who had raised me to value honesty and hard work. Brad wasn't going to develop a conscience about stealing from a veteran. Stood up slowly, my military training kicking in as I surveyed the situation with tactical clarity. This was no longer about recovering my college fund or getting an apology. This was about survival, about protecting myself from people who had proven they would sacrifice my future for their temporary pleasure. The daughter who had spent years Making herself smaller to accommodate other people's needs was gone, replaced by someone who had learned in the harshest possible classroom that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones most willing to betray you. Walking to my dresser, I pulled out the manila envelope where I kept my important documents, discharge papers, medical records, and the acceptance letter from State University that had arrived the same day I discovered their theft. My fingers traced the university letterhead as I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I wasn't going to beg them to give my money back. I wasn't going to guilt them into doing the right thing. I wasn't going to waste another moment of my life trying to make them understand the magnitude of what they had stolen from me. The acceptance letter represented more than just admission to a program. It represented a path forward that didn't depend on people who had already proven themselves untrustworthy. State University had offered me partial financial aid, and while it wouldn't cover everything, it was a foundation I could build on. The GI Bill benefits would help, and I could find work-study programs, take out loans if necessary, create a new plan that didn't involve trusting anyone else with my future. I pulled my laptop from under the bed and began researching with the same methodical intensity I had once applied to mission planning overseas. Financial aid offices, scholarship databases, veterans assistance programs, part-time job opportunities near campus. The internet became my reconnaissance tool as I mapped out a completely different route to the same destination. If they thought stealing my money would derail my dreams, they had seriously underestimated what 18 months of military service had taught me about resilience and resourcefulness. The breakthrough came when I discovered the Veterans Emergency Assistance Program, a fund specifically designed to help military personnel who faced unexpected financial hardships. The irony wasn't lost on me that my own family had created the emergency that qualified me for assistance, but I pushed that bitter thought aside and focused on the application requirements. They wanted documentation of the hardship, proof of military service, and a detailed plan for how the assistance would be used. As I filled out the forms, describing how my college fund had been unexpectedly unavailable, I felt something shifting inside me. Each question I answered, each document I uploaded, was a step away from the people who had betrayed me, and toward a future I would create entirely on my own terms. The bureaucratic language couldn't capture the emotional devastation of their theft, but it could capture the practical reality. I was a veteran who needed help to pursue higher education, and there were systems in place to provide that help. The real transformation happened when I started reaching out to other veterans. Online, connecting with forums and social media groups where people shared similar stories. I wasn't the only one who had returned from deployment to find family members had misused money or resources left in their care. There was an entire community of people who understood the unique betrayal of having your service exploited by the Chiao. Very people you thought you were protecting. One veteran named Jessica had returned from Iraq to discover her husband had emptied their joint account to start a business that failed within 6 months. Another, Marcus, had found out his parents had used his savings to pay off their credit card debt, claiming it was a family emergency that required immediate action. Reading their stories, I realized that what had happened to me wasn't just personal weakness or bad judgment on my part. It was part of a larger pattern of how some people viewed military pay and benefits as communal property rather than individual earnings. These online conversations became my lifeline during the darkest moments of doubt. When I questioned whether I was overreacting or being ungrateful, when Mom's tears and Brad's justifications made me wonder if I was the one being unreasonable, I could return to these forums and read stories from people who validated my experience. They understood that military pay wasn't easy money. It was compensation for risking your life, for being separated from everything familiar, for enduring physical and emotional challenges that most people couldn't imagine. Through these connections, I learned about resources I never knew existed. Veterans organizations that provided emergency funding for education, scholarship programs specifically for female veterans, work-study positions at universities that paid above minimum wage, and offered flexible schedules. Mentorship programs that connected student veterans with successful professionals in their chosen fields. A whole ecosystem of support that didn't depend on family members who might decide your dreams were less important than their desires. The most important thing I learned was that cutting toxic people out of your life, even when they're family, isn't cruelty, it's self-preservation. One veteran named Sarah told me about her decision to go no contact with relatives who had consistently taken advantage of her military benefits, treating her like a personal ATM rather than a family member. The hardest part, she wrote, was realizing that I had been so focused on being a good daughter, a good sister, a good family member, that I forgot to be good to myself. That comment hit me like a physical blow because it captured exactly what had been happening in my own life. I had been so conditioned to put everyone else's needs first, to be the reliable one who never complained, that I had made myself vulnerable to exploitation. My willingness to sacrifice, which had served me well in the military, had become a liability in civilian relationships where not everyone operated with the same code of honor and mutual support. As the pieces of my new plan fell into place, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not hope that Mom and Brad would suddenly develop consciences and return my money, but hope that I could succeed despite their betrayal. Hope that the skills and discipline I had developed in the military would serve me just as well in college. Hope that I could build a life that didn't depend on people who had proven themselves unreliable. The final component of my internal transformation was the realization that I didn't owe them an explanation for my choices going forward. I didn't need to justify my decision to pursue my education through alternative means. I didn't need to argue with them about the morality of their actions or try to make them understand the impact of their betrayal. They had made their choice when they decided my future was worth less than their present comfort. Now it was time for me to make mine. The morning I decided to leave, I woke up before dawn with a clarity that felt almost supernatural. There was no dramatic music playing in my head, no cinematic moment of revelation. Just the quiet certainty that staying in this house another day would be choosing to participate in my own destruction. I lay in my narrow childhood bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me, and realized that these walls no longer represented home. They represented a trap disguised as family love. I moved through my morning routine, with the same methodical precision I had used during pre-mission preparations overseas. Every action had a purpose. Every decision was calculated to advance my objective. I wasn't running away in emotional chaos. I was executing a strategic withdrawal from hostile territory. The difference mattered, both to my self-respect and to my chances of success. My belongings fit into 2 military duffel bags and a backpack, a testament to how little I had accumulated during my years of saving every penny for college. Folded. Uniforms, civilian clothes that still smelled faintly of deployment laundry detergent, a few books I couldn't bear to leave behind. The acceptance letter from State University went into the front pocket of my backpack, along with my discharge papers and the documentation I would need to rebuild my life from scratch. The hardest items to pack were the things that represented my relationship with Mom before Brad entered our lives. The photo of us at my high school graduation, both of us grinning despite the financial stress that had defined those years. The card she had sent me during my first week of basic training, filled with proud words about my courage and strength. The bracelet she had made me from paracord, a tangible reminder that someone back home was thinking about me during the darkest moments of deployment. I almost left them behind, these artifacts of a relationship that no longer existed. But something stopped me as I reached for the trash can. These weren't just reminders of betrayal. They were evidence that the woman who had raised me had been real, even if she was gone now. Taking them with me wasn't about clinging to false hope. It was about honoring the version of my mother who had sacrificed to give me opportunities, even if that woman had been replaced by someone willing to steal those same opportunities away. Downstairs, I could hear Mom and Brad moving around the kitchen, their voices carrying the casual intimacy of people who shared secrets and inside jokes. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and I caught fragments of their conversation about dinner plans, weekend trips, mundane domestic details that felt grotesquely normal given what they had done to me. They were living their lives as if nothing had changed, as if the destruction of my future was just another Tuesday morning in their happy household. I wrote 2 letters that morning, sitting at the small desk in my room where I had once done homework and filled out college applications. The first was addressed to Mom, though I knew Brad would read it too. I kept it brief and factual, explaining that I was moving out to pursue my education through alternative means. I didn't mention the stolen money or their betrayal. Those facts were self-evident and didn't require my commentary. I simply stated that I would be creating a life that didn't depend on people who had proven themselves unreliable. The second letter was addressed to myself, a practice I had learned during deployment when the isolation and stress became overwhelming. I wrote about the person I was choosing to become, someone who valued herself enough to walk away from toxicity, even when it wore the mask of family loyalty. Someone who understood that love without respect was just manipulation with better marketing. Someone who would never again make herself small to accommodate other people's selfishness. As I sealed both letters, I heard Brad's motorcycle roar to life in the driveway, the Harley he had bought with my college fund, heading off to whatever midlife crisis adventure had captured his attention today. The sound that should have filled me with rage instead filled me with resolve. Every time I heard that engine, I would remember this moment, this choice to value my own future over their comfort. I called my Army buddy Rachel, who had moved to the city near State University after her discharge. We had stayed in touch through deployment and the difficult transition back to civilian life, sharing the unique challenges that came with being young women in the military, and then trying to figure out who we were without uniforms and rank structure. When I explained my situation, carefully editing out the most painful details, she didn't hesitate. "My couch is yours for as long as you need it," she said, her voice carrying the immediate solidarity that existed between veterans who understood that sometimes family meant the people who chose to have your back, not the people who shared your DNA. I work at a restaurant downtown that's always hiring servers. The tips are decent, and they're flexible with class schedules. We'll figure this out together. The relief I felt at her unconditional support was almost overwhelming. After weeks of having my reality questioned and my feelings dismissed, talking to someone who understood the concept of loyalty was like taking a deep breath after being underwater. Rachel didn't need extensive explanations or justifications for my decision to leave. She trusted that I was making the right choice for myself, and that trust felt more valuable than all the money Brad and Mom had stolen. I arranged for a taxi to pick me up at the end of our street, not wanting the drama of Brad or Mom seeing me leave with luggage. The symbolism of walking away rather than being driven away mattered to me. This was my choice, my decision, my first step toward a future I would build without their interference or support. Before I left, I took one final walk through the house, not out of nostalgia but out of thoroughness. I was closing a chapter of my life, and I wanted to be certain I wasn't leaving anything behind that I would need for the next one. In Mom's room, I found the framed photo of my military graduation ceremony sitting face down on her dresser. Apparently, too painful a reminder of the daughter she had betrayed for the lifestyle she preferred. I set the photo upright and placed my letter to Mom beside it, knowing she would find it when she returned from whatever shopping expedition or spa day Brad had planned for her today. The gesture wasn't meant to be cruel, it was meant to be clear. I was her daughter who had served her country with honor, and no amount of rationalization or victim blaming would change that fact. As I walked down the street toward my taxi, dragging my duffel bags behind me, I felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. The choice to enlist when college seemed impossible. The choice to save money instead of spending it on deployment luxuries. The choice to trust family members with my future. And now, the choice to reclaim that future by walking away from people who had proven they didn't deserve access to it. The taxi driver helped me load my bags into the trunk, and as we pulled away from the curb, I didn't look back at the house, where I had grown up. That part of my story was over, and I was finally ready to write the next chapter entirely on my own terms. Rachel's apartment was a cramped 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse, but it felt like a palace compared to the emotional suffocation I had left behind. She cleared out half her closet without being asked, made space in the bathroom cabinet for my toiletries, and introduced me to her neighbors as my sister Maya, the veteran who's starting college. The casual way she claimed me as family, without conditions or expectations, was a stark contrast to the transactional relationships I had just escaped. The first week was a whirlwind of practical necessities. Rachel drove me to the restaurant where she worked, a bustling Italian place called Marcello's that specialized in authentic pasta and employed a surprising number of veterans and college students. The owner, Tony Marcello, was a second-generation Italian-American who had built his business on the principle that hard work deserved fair compensation. When Rachel mentioned I was a veteran looking for flexible work to support my education, he hired me on the spot. "Military people know how to follow orders and work under pressure," Tony said, his thick Brooklyn accent, somehow making everything sound both authoritative and welcoming. "You start tomorrow night. Training shift with Rachel, then you're on your own. Tips here are good if you work for them, terrible if you don't. I'm guessing you know how to work." His assessment was accurate. Within 2 weeks, I was earning enough in tips to cover my share of rent and groceries, with enough left over to start rebuilding my emergency fund. The rhythm of restaurant work was surprisingly therapeutic. There was something honest about the immediate feedback loop of good service equals good tips, effort equals reward. Unlike the complex emotional manipulation I had navigated at home, the expectations at Marcello's were straightforward. Show up on time, treat customers well, support your fellow servers, and you would be supported in return. The simplicity was a revelation after months of trying to decode hidden agendas and unspoken expectations. My coworkers became an unexpected source of strength and inspiration. Maria, a single mother working her way through nursing school, showed me how to maximize efficiency during busy shifts to increase tip potential. Jake, a former Marine who had lost part of his leg in Afghanistan, demonstrated how to turn military experience into rapport with customers, especially the older generation who respected service members. Sarah, an art student who worked weekend shifts to pay for supplies, taught me that pursuing your passion didn't have to mean choosing between dreams and survival. The stories they shared during slow shifts became my education in resilience. Maria talked about studying for nursing exams in her car, between her restaurant job and her night shift at a hotel, using the parking lot lights to read her textbooks. Jake described the months of physical therapy that had taught him to see obstacles as problems to solve rather than reasons to quit. Sarah showed me photos of the sculptures she created from materials she found in dumpsters behind construction sites, explaining how limitation could spark creativity rather than kill it. These conversations gradually rewired my understanding of what success looked like. For years, I had imagined college as a linear path. Save money, pay tuition, attend classes, graduate, get a career. The theft of my college fund had shattered that narrative, leaving me feeling like a failure before I had even begun. But watching my coworkers juggle multiple jobs, unconventional schedules, and creative solutions to financial challenges showed me that there were infinite ways to reach the same destination. My academic restart began with a single phone call to the financial aid office at State University. The woman who answered, Mrs. Patterson, had a voice that managed to be both professional and maternal, the tone of someone who had helped countless students navigate seemingly impossible financial situations. When I explained that my original funding had become unavailable and I needed to explore alternative options, she didn't ask probing questions about family drama or personal failures. She simply scheduled an appointment for the following week and told me to bring documentation of my military service and current financial status. The meeting with Mrs. Patterson became the foundation of my academic recovery plan. She walked me through the process of applying for emergency financial aid, explained how my veteran status qualified me for programs I hadn't known existed, and connected me with the campus Veterans Resource Center. More importantly, she helped me understand that starting college a semester late, or taking a reduced course load to accommodate work schedules, wasn't falling behind. It was making strategic adjustments to ensure long-term success. The Veterans Resource Center became my second headquarters, a place where my military experience was seen as an asset rather than an oddity. The coordinator, a former Air Force sergeant named Dave, had the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who understood both military culture and academic bureaucracy. He helped me apply for a work-study position in the engineering department, connected me with a scholarship program specifically for female veterans, and introduced me to other student veterans who had navigated similar challenges. Meeting other student veterans was like finding a tribe I didn't know I had been looking for. There was Jennifer, who had served in the Navy and was now studying mechanical engineering while raising 2 children as a single mother. Mark, who had done 3 tours in Iraq and was using his GI Bill benefits to pursue a degree in social work, so he could help other veterans adjust to civilian life. Lisa, who had been a medic in Afghanistan and was now pre-med, determined to become a doctor despite starting college at 25. Their stories of resilience and adaptation became the blueprint for my own academic journey. Jennifer showed me how to use military time management skills to balance study schedules with work commitments. Mark taught me about the importance of finding professors who understood the unique challenges veterans faced in traditional college environments. Lisa demonstrated how to translate military experience into compelling scholarship applications and internship opportunities. The scholarship application process became my part-time job. Every evening after my restaurant shift, I would sit at Rachel's kitchen table with my laptop, researching opportunities and crafting essays that told my story without dwelling on victimhood. I wrote about leadership experience gained during deployment, about problem-solving skills developed under pressure, about the discipline required to save money in an environment where most people spent every dollar they earned. One application required an essay about overcoming adversity, and I found myself writing about the theft of my college fund for the first time. Not as a sob story designed to elicit sympathy, but as a case study in adaptation and resilience. I described the initial shock and betrayal, but focused more on the systematic approach I had taken to rebuild my educational plans. The essay wasn't about what had been done to me. It was about what I had chosen to do in response. The breakthrough came when I received notification that I had been awarded the Patricia Collins Scholarship for Women Veterans, a $5,000 grant that would cover most of my tuition for the first year. The email arrived while I was at work, and I had to excuse myself to the restaurant storage room to read it privately. Sitting among boxes of pasta and canned tomatoes, I cried for the first time since leaving home. Not tears of sadness or anger, but tears of relief and vindication. That scholarship wasn't just money. It was validation that my service mattered, that my determination was recognized, that there were people in the world who believed I deserved support rather than exploitation. The letter from the scholarship committee specifically mentioned my essay about overcoming financial adversity, noting that my response to betrayal demonstrated exactly the kind of resilience and character they wanted to support. I called Rachel first, then Dave at the Veterans Center, then Mrs. Patterson at Financial Aid. Each conversation reinforced the network of support I had built through my own effort and initiative. These people celebrated my success because they had invested in my journey, not because they expected something in return. The contrast with my family's conditional love couldn't have been more stark. The practical aspects of starting college began to fall into place with surprising efficiency. I registered for a partial course load that would allow me to continue working at the restaurant while maintaining academic focus. I purchased used textbooks from other veterans, joined study groups with fellow non-traditional students, and scheduled my classes around my work commitments rather than the other way around. My first day of classes felt like a victory lap, even though it was really just the beginning of the race. Sitting in engineering mathematics with my notebook and pencils arranged precisely on my desk, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The girl who had trusted her family with her future was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned to trust herself above all others. The transformation wasn't just financial or academic, it was fundamental. I had learned that rebuilding from betrayal wasn't about returning to who you were before. It was about becoming someone stronger, someone who couldn't be victimized again because they had developed the skills and support systems necessary for true independence. 6 months into my new life, I had settled into a rhythm that felt both sustainable and empowering. My days began at 5:30 in the morning with a run through the city streets, a habit I had maintained from my military service that helped me process stress and maintain the physical discipline that kept everything else in my life organized. After my run, I would review my class notes over coffee while Rachel got ready for her early shift at a different restaurant. Our quiet morning routine, a testament to how two people could share space without drama or hidden agendas. My engineering classes were challenging but manageable, especially with the study habits I had developed during military training. The other students were mostly 18 and 19 years old, fresh out of high school with parents paying their tuition and unlimited meal plans. But I found common ground with the handful of other non-traditional students who understood that education was a privilege earned rather than an expectation inherited. Professor Williams, who taught my calculus course, had served in Vietnam and recognized something familiar in my approach to problem solving that led to conversations after class about how military experience translated into academic advantage. The poor evenings at Marcello's had become more than just a job. They were my social laboratory, a place where I practiced the art of building relationships based on mutual respect rather than familial obligation. The regular customers began to request my section, not just because I was efficient and friendly, but because I remembered their preferences, asked about their families, and treated every interaction as an opportunity to create a positive experience for someone else. The tips reflected this attention to detail, and my nightly earnings often exceeded what I had made in a week during my military service. Tony Marcello had noticed my work ethic and begun involving me in training new servers, recognizing that my military background made me naturally suited to teaching systems and procedures. The additional responsibility came with a small increase in hourly pay, but more importantly, it gave me confidence in my ability to lead and teach in civilian contexts. These skills would translate well to the engineering field, where collaboration and knowledge transfer were essential components of any successful project. The Veterans Resource Center had become my second home, a place where I could decompress between the high energy of restaurant work and the intellectual demands of my coursework. Dave had introduced me to Dr. Martinez, a professor in the engineering department who was conducting research on sustainable energy systems and needed undergraduate assistance for data analysis. The position paid modestly, but provided invaluable experience in real-world engineering applications, and Dr. Martinez had already mentioned the possibility of continuing the work through graduate school if my academic performance remained strong. My relationship with Rachel had evolved from desperate gratitude to genuine friendship, built on shared experiences and mutual support rather than emergency assistance. She had been accepted into a culinary program at the community college and was planning to open her own catering business within 2 years. We spent Sunday afternoons experimenting with recipes in our tiny kitchen, her teaching me about flavor profiles and presentation while I helped her develop business plans and financial projections. Our friendship had become a model for what healthy relationships looked like: two people supporting each other's goals without keeping score or expecting sacrifice. the scholarship money had provided more than tuition relief. It had given me breathing room to focus on long-term planning rather than daily survival. I had opened a new savings account at a different bank, one that required 2 forms of identification and multiple security questions to access. Every tip, from the restaurant, every dollar from my research position, every penny I didn't absolutely need for immediate expenses went into that account. The balance grew slowly but steadily, a foundation for future security that no one could access or manipulate except me. My academic performance had exceeded even my own expectations. The discipline required for military service translated seamlessly into the structured demands of engineering coursework, and my practical experience with logistics and problem-solving gave me advantages over classmates who had only learned from textbooks. Professor Chen, who taught my materials science course, had commented on my midterm exam that my answers demonstrated not just understanding of theoretical concepts, but insight into their practical applications, a perspective that typically developed only after years of field experience. The success felt surreal sometimes, like I was living someone else's life. For so many years, I had operated under the assumption that progress required sacrifice, that achieving my goals meant enduring other people's demands and expectations. The discovery that I could thrive without those constraints was both liberating and disorienting. There were moments when I caught myself waiting for the other shoe to drop, for some external force to disrupt the stability I had created, until I remembered that I was now the primary force shaping my own circumstances. That stability was tested when I received my first contact from home in 8 months. Not from Mom or Brad directly, but from my Aunt Karen, Mom's sister, who had tracked down my new phone number through a mutual acquaintance. The text message was brief but loaded with implications. "Maya, your mother is having a hard time. Brad left her last month. She needs family right now. Please call me." I stared at the message for a long time, sitting in the Veterans Center, between classes, trying to process the information and my own reaction to it. Part of me felt a familiar pull, the ingrained response to family crisis that had shaped so many of my decisions over the years. Another part of me felt vindicated, that Brad's promises of security and stability had proven as hollow as I had suspected. But the strongest emotion was something unexpected, a kind of detached sympathy, the way you might feel reading about strangers' misfortunes in a newspaper. The absence of immediate guilt or urgency surprised me. For years, any hint of Mom's distress would have sent me into crisis mode, dropping everything to provide whatever support or solution was needed. Now, I found myself analyzing the situation with the same strategic thinking I applied to engineering problems. What were the facts? What were the assumptions? What were the potential consequences of different responses? I called Karen that evening from the restaurant's back office during my break, choosing a time and place where I could control the conversation's length and emotional intensity. Her voice carried the familiar tone of family members who specialized in crisis management, the breathless urgency that made everything sound like an emergency requiring immediate action. "Maya, thank God you called back," Karen began without preamble. "Your mother is devastated. Brad took half of everything when he left, including the money from selling that timeshare. She's behind on her mortgage and car payment, and she's too proud to ask for help, but I can see she's falling apart. She cries every time your name comes up." The manipulation was so obvious it almost made me laugh. The assumption that Mom's poor choices were my responsibility. The emotional blackmail disguised as family concern. The suggestion that my absence was somehow cruel rather than necessary for my own well-being. Karen was using the same playbook that had worked on me for years, but the person she was talking to now had developed immunity to these tactics. "I'm sorry to hear Mom is struggling," I replied, keeping my voice neutral and professional. "Financial difficulties are always stressful. I hope she's able to find solutions that work for her situation." The careful distance in my language wasn't accidental. It was a boundary designed to prevent emotional manipulation from gaining traction. Karen's voice sharpened with frustration at my lack of immediate compliance. "Maya, she's your mother. She made mistakes, but she needs you now. You're the only family she has left who's doing well. Surely you can help her catch up on her bills, at least until she gets back on her feet." The familiar script was unfolding, exactly as I had predicted. Crisis, guilt, financial demand, assumption that my success existed primarily to solve other people's problems. But the person Karen was trying to manipulate no longer existed. That daughter had been replaced by someone who understood that helping people who had proven themselves willing to exploit your generosity wasn't kindness. It was enabling destructive behavior. "I understand you're concerned about Mom," I said, carefully. "But I'm sure she'll figure out solutions that work for her. She's an adult who's capable of making her own financial decisions, just like she did when she chose to spend my college fund on luxury items with Brad. I have confidence in her ability to handle her current situation the same way." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Karen had expected emotional capitulation, immediate offers of financial assistance, guilty apologies for not being available during Mom's crisis. Instead, she was hearing clear boundaries delivered without anger or defensiveness, a response that didn't fit the narrative she had constructed about family obligation and filial duty. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from crisis management to moral judgment. "I can't believe how cold you've become, Maya. This isn't the girl I remember, the one who always put family first. The military changed you, and not for the better. That accusation might have devastated me a year ago, but now it felt like confirmation that I was moving in the right direction." The girl Karen remembered was someone who had been trained to sacrifice her own well-being for other people's comfort. Someone whose value was measured by her willingness to absorb other people's problems and poor decisions. If becoming cold meant refusing to enable financial irresponsibility and emotional manipulation, then I would accept that characterization gladly. The call from Karen turned out to be just the opening salvo in what would become a months-long campaign to draw me back into the family dysfunction I had worked so hard to escape. Within days of our conversation, I began receiving messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, each one carrying the same basic script with slight variations in delivery and emotional intensity. Cousin Michelle sent a long Facebook message about the importance of forgiveness and second chances. Uncle Robert left a voicemail about how family disagreements shouldn't tear people apart permanently. Even my grandmother, who rarely used technology, somehow managed to send me an email with subject line, "Please come home," that had clearly been composed by someone else but sent from her account. The coordination was obvious and almost insulting in its transparency. Someone had distributed my contact information along with talking points designed to maximize guilt and minimize my ability to maintain boundaries. The messages all contained the same key elements. Mom was suffering. Brad had taken advantage. Of her, I was the only one who could help. Family was more important than money. Forgiveness was a virtue. Holding grudges was unhealthy. It was emotional manipulation by committee, a group effort to overwhelm my defenses through sheer volume and coordinated pressure. What surprised me most was how little impact the campaign had on my emotional equilibrium. A year ago, receiving disappointed messages from extended family would have sent me into spirals of self-doubt and guilt. I would have questioned my own perceptions, wondered if I was being unreasonably harsh, considered whether maintaining my boundaries was worth the family discord it was causing. But the person I had become through military service and independent living had developed what felt like emotional armor, the ability to recognize manipulation even when it came wrapped in familiar voices and family loyalty. I developed a systematic approach to handling the family pressure that reflected my engineering training in problem-solving and my military experience with psychological operations. First, I documented everything. Screenshots of messages, recordings of voicemails, notes about who had contacted me and what specific arguments they had used. The pattern that emerged was revealing. None of them asked about my life, my education, my well-being, or my goals. Their concern was entirely focused on my utility as a solution to Mom's self-created problems. Second, I crafted a standard response that I could adapt slightly for different relatives while maintaining consistent boundaries. The message was polite, but firm, acknowledging their concern while making clear that I would not be resuming financial or emotional responsibility for Mom's choices. I explained that I was focusing on my education and building a stable future, and that I wished Mom well in resolving her current difficulties through her own resources and decision-making. The responses to my boundary setting were illuminating, in their diversity and intensity. Some relatives simply stopped contacting me altogether, apparently deciding that I was a lost cause if I wouldn't immediately rush to Mom's rescue. Others doubled down on the guilt and manipulation, sending increasingly dramatic messages about family loyalty and the devastating impact of my selfishness on Mom's mental health. A few tried different approaches, offering to mediate a reconciliation, suggesting compromises like sending smaller amounts of money, or proposing family meetings where we could work everything out. The most revealing response came from my cousin David, who had always been the family's designated peacekeeper and problem solver. His message was longer and more thoughtful than the others, acknowledging that Mom and Brad had made poor decisions while still arguing that family forgiveness required setting aside grievances for the greater good. What struck me most was his assumption that my boundaries were temporary, a phase I was going through that would eventually give way to resumed family responsibility once I had made my point. David's message helped me understand something crucial about the family dynamic I had escaped. They viewed my independence not as a permanent life change, but as a rebellious phase that would eventually end when I came to my senses and resumed my role as the family's emotional and financial backup system. They couldn't conceive of a world where I permanently prioritized my own well-being over their demands, because that would fundamentally alter the family structure that had served them so well for years. This realization was both liberating and infuriating. Liberating because it confirmed that my decision to leave had been necessary and correct. They would never voluntarily release me from the role of family caretaker and problem solver. Infuriating because it meant they viewed my personal growth and independence as inherently selfish, a betrayal of natural family order rather than a healthy progression toward adult autonomy. The pressure campaign reached its crescendo when Mom herself finally called, her voice shaking with the kind of theatrical emotion that had once guaranteed my immediate compliance. She had clearly prepared for the conversation, probably with coaching from Karen or one of the other relatives who had been unsuccessful in their attempts to guilt me into submission. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was studying for my thermodynamics exam, the timing seemingly designed to catch me during a stressful period when my defenses might be lowered. "Maya, sweetheart, please don't hang up," she began, her voice breaking with practiced vulnerability. "I know I hurt you, and I know you're angry with me, but I need you to understand that everything that happened with Brad was my mistake, not my choice. He manipulated me, convinced me that spending your money was the right thing to do for our family's future. I was lonely and desperate, and I made terrible decisions, but losing you has been the worst consequence of all." The narrative she was weaving was carefully constructed to minimize her agency while maximizing my sympathy. In her version of events, she was a victim of Brad's manipulation rather than a willing participant in stealing my future. The implication was that understanding her victimhood should lead naturally to forgiveness and resumed financial support, that recognizing her vulnerability should override my need for self-protection. I let her talk without interruption, listening to the performance with the analytical detachment I had developed through months of therapy and self-reflection at the Veterans Resource Center. The story contained elements that were probably true. Brad had likely manipulated her to some degree, and she probably did feel regret about losing access to my financial support. But the core assumption underlying her appeal remained unchanged. My role was to absorb the consequences of her poor choices, while receiving minimal respect or consideration in return. When she finished her prepared remarks, the silence stretched between us like a chasm. She was waiting for the response that would signal my capitulation: tears, apologies, offers of help, emotional reunion. Instead, she got something she had never heard from me before: a calm, clear statement of reality delivered without anger or defensiveness. "Mom, I understand that you're facing financial difficulties, and I'm sorry that Brad left you in a difficult situation," I said, my voice steady and professional. "However, the decision to spend my college fund wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you chose to do. You had multiple opportunities to discuss your financial stress with me, to ask for help or advice, to find solutions that didn't involve stealing money I had earned through military service. Instead, you chose to betray my trust and then lie about it for months." Her sharp intake of breath told me that this wasn't the response she had expected or prepared for. The daughter she remembered would have been defensive about being accused of cruelty, would have accepted responsibility for family problems that weren't her fault, would have prioritized Mom's emotional comfort over her own need for accountability. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice rising with frustration at my lack of immediate forgiveness. "Everything I did was for our family, to try to build something better for all of us. You're my daughter, and I need you to help me get through this difficult time." That's what daughters do for their mothers. The entitlement in that final statement was breathtaking in its audacity. After stealing my future to fund luxury purchases with her boyfriend, after months of no contact, after coordinating a family pressure campaign designed to guilt me into submission, she was still operating under the assumption that my primary purpose in life was to solve her problems. The role of daughter in her definition was indistinguishable from the role of financial safety net and emotional support system. "That's not what daughters do for their mothers, Mom," I replied quietly. "That's what enablers do for people who refuse to take responsibility for their own choices. I'm your daughter, which means I love you enough to hope you'll learn from your mistakes and build a better life. But I'm not your backup plan, your financial solution, or your emotional crutch. Those roles are incompatible with having a healthy relationship or a successful future." The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there, with Mom cycling through anger, bargaining, guilt-tripping, and finally threats. She accused me of being selfish, ungrateful, and cold-hearted. She claimed that my military service had damaged me psychologically, making me incapable of normal family love. She suggested that I would regret my cruelty when she was dead, and it was too late to make amends. Finally, she threatened to cut me out of her will, as if inheritance from someone who had already stolen my money was somehow a compelling incentive for resumed compliance. Each escalation confirmed that I had made the right decision in maintaining my boundaries. The woman on the phone wasn't interested in rebuilding a relationship based on mutual respect and accountability. She wanted to restore the previous dynamic where my resources and emotional energy existed primarily to serve her needs and wants. The conversation ended when I calmly told her that I hoped she would find healthy solutions to her current difficulties, and that I would be open to future contact when she was ready to discuss rebuilding our relationship on terms that didn't involve my resuming responsibility for her. 2 years had passed since I walked away from my mother's house with nothing but my military duffel bags and a determination to build something they couldn't destroy. The transformation in my life was so complete that sometimes I felt like I was living in someone else's story, one where hard work actually led to tangible rewards, and where the people around me celebrated success rather than trying to exploit. My academic achievements had exceeded every expectation I had dared to hold during those dark months, when my college fund disappeared into Brad's motorcycle and vacation fantasies. I had not only maintained a perfect GPA in my engineering program, but had been inducted into the Honor Society and selected as a research assistant for Dr. Martinez's Sustainable Energy Project. The work was challenging and intellectually stimulating in ways that made every hour feel like an investment in a future I was actively creating, rather than hoping someone else would provide. The research position had evolved from data analysis to co-authoring papers, with Dr. Martinez consistently impressed by my ability to translate theoretical concepts into practical applications. My military experience with logistics and problem-solving under pressure had given me insights into system efficiency that complemented his academic expertise perfectly. We had presented our findings at 2 conferences, with plans to submit our work to a prestigious engineering journal within the next 6 months. More significantly, Dr. Martinez had nominated me for the Hartwell Fellowship, a prestigious award that provided full funding for graduate school, plus a research stipend that would allow me to pursue my master's degree without working multiple jobs. The application process was rigorous, requiring detailed academic transcripts, recommendation letters, and a comprehensive research proposal. But Dr. Martinez was confident that my combination of academic excellence and real-world experience made me a compelling candidate. My financial situation had stabilized in ways that felt almost miraculous compared to the desperate uncertainty I had faced when my family betrayed me. The combination of scholarship money, work-study income, and tips from Marcello's had allowed me to not only cover my living expenses, but to rebuild my emergency fund. The new savings account, protected by security measures that ensured I was the only person with access, had grown to over $6,000, not quite enough to replace what had been stolen, but sufficient to provide the security and independence I had learned to value above all else. Rachel and I had moved to a larger apartment near campus, a 2-bedroom unit that felt luxurious compared to our previous cramped quarters. She had completed her culinary program and was working as a sous chef at an upscale restaurant while building her catering business on weekends. Our friendship had deepened into something that felt like chosen family, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than obligation or manipulation. We celebrated each other's successes without keeping score, supported each other through challenges without creating debt, and had learned that healthy relationships actually made life easier rather than more complicated. The veterans community had become my anchor, providing both practical support and emotional validation that I hadn't known I needed. Dave had connected me with a network of female veterans who met monthly to discuss everything from academic challenges to career planning to navigating relationships with civilians who didn't understand military culture. These women had become mentors, friends, and inspiration, showing me different models for how to build successful lives after service. One member of the group, Lieutenant Colonel Janet Reynolds, had taken particular interest in my academic progress and career aspirations. She was now a senior engineer at a major aerospace company and had been following my research work with Dr. Martinez through our published papers. When she learned about my interest in sustainable energy systems, she arranged for me to spend a summer as an intern at her company, working on projects that would provide invaluable industry experience while further building my professional network. The internship had been a revelation, confirming that my academic work was preparing me for real-world applications that could make a meaningful difference in addressing global energy challenges. My supervisors had been impressed enough to offer me a position after graduation, contingent on completing my degree with continued strong performance. The offer included a signing bonus that would completely eliminate any remaining financial stress and allow me to focus entirely on my studies and research. My personal relationships had also evolved in ways that reflected my new understanding of what healthy dynamics looked like. I had started dating Marcus, a fellow veteran who was pursuing a degree in environmental science with plans to work in conservation policy. Our relationship was built on shared values and mutual support rather than need or dependency, and he understood both my military background and my commitment to maintaining independence. He celebrated my achievements without trying to diminish them, supported my goals without trying to redirect them, and respected my boundaries without testing or challenging them. The contrast between Marcus's approach to relationships and the family dynamics I had escaped was stark and instructive. When I told him about the Hartwell Fellowship application, his immediate response was excitement and pride in my accomplishments. When I expressed anxiety about the competition and selection process, he offered practical support like helping me proofread my application materials and practicing presentation skills. When I worried about imposter syndrome and whether I truly deserved such prestigious recognition, he reminded me of my achievements and qualifications without dismissing my feelings or trying to fix my emotional processing. This kind of supportive partnership was a revelation for someone who had grown up believing that love required sacrifice and that asking for help meant becoming indebted to someone who would eventually demand repayment. Marcus demonstrated daily that healthy relationships were characterized by mutual enhancement rather than mutual exploitation, that two people could support each other's growth without keeping scorecards or creating obligations. The culmination of my academic success came in the form of an email that arrived on a Thursday morning while I was reviewing materials for my advanced thermodynamics exam. The subject line read, "Hartwell Fellowship Selection Committee Decision," and for a moment I was afraid to open it, terrified that rejection would somehow diminish everything I had accomplished through 2 years of relentless work and determination. The first word of the email was, "Congratulations," and I had to read the sentence 3 times before the meaning penetrated my disbelief. I had been selected as a Hartwell Fellow, one of only 12 recipients nationwide, based on my academic excellence, research potential, and demonstrated leadership qualities. The fellowship would cover full tuition and fees for my master's program, provide a generous living stipend, and include funding for conference presentations and research materials. I sat in the university library, surrounded by other students preparing for finals, trying to process the magnitude of what this recognition meant. Not only was my future secured in ways I had never dared to imagine, but my work was being validated at the highest levels of academic achievement. The research I had conducted with Dr. Martinez, the papers we had published, the presentations we had given, all of it had led to this moment of recognition that felt like vindication for every sacrifice I had made and every boundary I had maintained. The fellowship notification included a personal note from Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the program's founder, commending my resilience in overcoming financial adversity and my commitment to using education as a tool for both personal advancement and societal contribution. She specifically mentioned my military service and my research focus on sustainable energy systems as evidence of my dedication to making meaningful contributions to engineering science. Reading her words, I thought about the girl who had stood in her mother's kitchen 2 years ago, holding an acceptance letter that had felt worthless without the financial foundation that had been stolen from her. That girl could never have imagined that her worst betrayal would ultimately lead to opportunities far greater than anything she had originally planned. The theft of my college fund had forced me to develop skills, connections, and self-reliance that had made me a stronger candidate for elite academic programs than I would have been if everything had gone according to my original plan. I called Dr. Martinez first, catching him between classes to share the news. His enthusiasm was infectious and deeply satisfying. This recognition reflected well on his mentorship and research program, but more importantly, it validated his decision to take a chance on an undergraduate veteran who had needed someone to believe in her potential. We made plans to celebrate with the rest of the research team and to begin planning my graduate work under his continued supervision. Rachel was my second call, and her shriek of excitement was loud enough to attract stares from other library patrons. She insisted on planning a celebration dinner at our apartment, complete with homemade pasta and the expensive wine we had been saving for special occasions. Marcus offered to cook, demonstrating again his instinct to support my achievements by contributing to the celebration rather than making it about himself. The veterans group was my third notification, and their response confirmed once again that I had found my true tribe. Janet Reynolds called personally to congratulate me and to discuss how the fellowship would position me for even greater opportunities in aerospace engineering. She mentioned specific projects her company was planning that would align perfectly with my research interests, painting a picture of a career trajectory that could take me anywhere I wanted to go. As the news spread through my network of supporters, professors, classmates, co-workers at Marcello's, friends from the veterans community, I was struck by how genuine and uncomplicated their celebrations were. No one asked what the fellowship meant for their own benefit. No one suggested that my success created obligations or expectations beyond my own goals and ambitions. No one treated my achievement as family property that should be shared or redistributed, according to someone else's priorities. The contrast with my family's approach to my previous accomplishments was impossible to ignore. When I had made Dean's List during my first semester, when I had been selected for the research position, when I had won smaller scholarships and awards, their response had always been about what my success meant for them rather than what it meant for me. My achievements were valuable primarily as evidence that I was a good investment, a reliable resource who could be counted on to provide future support and assistance. The Hartwell Fellowship announcement was published in the university newsletter on a Monday morning, complete with a feature article about my research work and military background. Dr. Martinez had provided quotes about my dedication and innovative thinking, while the piece highlighted my journey from veteran to academic achievement as an inspiring example of resilience and determination. The article included a photo from our latest research presentation and mentioned my plans to focus on sustainable energy grid optimization during my graduate studies. I was reviewing problem sets in the engineering library when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief but loaded with implications. Saw the article about your fellowship. We need to talk. This is your mother. My heart rate spiked involuntarily, the physiological response of someone who had trained themselves to recognize potential threats. After 18 months of silence, Mom had chosen this moment, my moment of triumph, to re-establish contact. The timing wasn't coincidental. Family members who had ignored my success when it was private suddenly found reasons to reach out once it became public knowledge. The fellowship represented not just academic achievement, but financial security, future earning potential, and social status. Exactly the kind of resources my family had always viewed as communal property rather than individual accomplishment. Didn't respond to the text immediately, instead taking time to consider the implications and prepare for what would inevitably be another attempt at manipulation. 2 years of independence had taught me that reactive responses usually led to mistakes, while strategic thinking produced better outcomes. I needed to understand what Mom wanted before deciding how much engagement, if any, was appropriate for my own well-being. The second text arrived 3 hours later, escalating the emotional pressure. Maya, I know you're angry, but I'm your mother. Families should share good news together. I've learned from my mistakes and I want to be part of your life again. The language was carefully chosen to trigger guilt while avoiding accountability. She acknowledged anger without taking responsibility for causing it, claimed family status as justification for renewed contact, and implied that my boundaries were keeping us apart rather than her betrayal. Rachel found me in our apartment that evening, staring at my phone with the kind of tactical focus I had once applied to mission planning. She had learned to recognize the signs of family-related stress and sat down beside me without asking questions, waiting for me to share whatever had disrupted my usual post-fellowship celebration mood. When I showed her the messages, her expression shifted from confusion to protective anger. "Are you seriously considering responding to her?" Rachel asked, her voice carrying the incredulous tone of someone who couldn't understand why anyone would voluntarily re-engage with people who had proven themselves untrustworthy. "Maya, you've built an incredible life without her interference. Why would you risk letting her back in now?" Her question forced me to examine my own motivations for even considering a response. Part of me was curious about what Mom wanted, whether she had genuinely learned from losing me or was simply trying another approach to accessing my resources. Another part wondered whether my success gave me enough security to engage from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. But the strongest impulse was something deeper and more complicated, the persistent hope that family relationships could be repaired if both parties were willing to change. I spent the next 2 days consulting with Dr. Patterson from the Counseling Center, a resource I had discovered through the Veterans Program. She specialized in helping people navigate complex family dynamics and had extensive experience with situations where military service created distance between veterans and civilian family members who didn't understand their experiences or growth. The question isn't whether your mother has changed, Dr. Patterson explained during our session. The question is whether you're prepared for the possibility that she hasn't, and whether you have sufficient boundaries in place to protect yourself. If this contact attempt follows the same patterns as previous interactions, her perspective helped me understand that engaging with Mom didn't have to be an all-or-nothing decision. I could respond on my own terms, maintaining clear boundaries while remaining open to the possibility of genuine change. If Mom had truly learned from our estrangement, she would respect my conditions and demonstrate accountability through actions rather than words. If she was simply trying another manipulation strategy, her true intentions would become clear quickly enough. I crafted my response carefully, choosing language that was polite but firm. I received your messages about the fellowship. I'm willing to have one conversation to hear what you want to say, but I need you to understand that my life has moved forward successfully without family involvement. If you're interested in rebuilding a relationship, it would need to be based on mutual respect and accountability, not on resuming previous patterns. Mom's response came within an hour, suggesting she had been waiting anxiously for any sign of engagement. Thank you for giving me a chance. Can we meet for coffee this weekend? I have so much I want to share with you, and I want to hear about all your accomplishments. I'm so proud of what you've achieved. The speed of her reply and the immediate suggestion of an in-person meeting raised red flags that I had learned to recognize. People who had genuinely changed usually approached reconciliation more gradually, respecting boundaries and demonstrating patience. The rush to face-to-face contact suggested someone who wanted to rely on emotional manipulation techniques that worked better in person than through written communication. I insisted on a phone conversation first, explaining that we needed to establish basic communication patterns before considering in-person meetings. Mom agreed reluctantly, and we scheduled a call for the following Thursday evening when I would be at Rachel's restaurant during her closing shift, ensuring I had both time limits and emotional support nearby if needed. The conversation began predictably, with Mom's voice carrying the familiar combination of manufactured vulnerability and barely contained excitement. She congratulated me on the fellowship repeatedly, emphasizing how proud she was and how she had always known I would achieve great things. The praise felt hollow because it came from someone who had demonstrated through actions that she didn't value my achievements enough to protect the resources that made them possible. Maya, I need you to know that losing you has been the worst thing that ever happened to me, she said, her voice breaking with practiced emotion. These past 2 years have been a nightmare. Brad left me with nothing, just like you said he would. I lost the house, had to move in with Karen temporarily, and I've been working 2 jobs just to pay off the debts he left behind. The narrative she was constructing positioned her as a victim of both Brad's betrayal and my abandonment, creating parallel grievances that justified each other in her mind. My refusal to rescue her from Brad's consequences was being presented as equivalent to Brad's financial exploitation, as if my self-protection was somehow similar to his predatory behavior. I understand you've faced financial difficulties, I replied carefully. That sounds very stressful. However, I want to be clear that my decision to maintain distance from our family wasn't about punishment or anger. It was about protecting myself from patterns that had proven harmful to my well-being and goals. Mom's tone shifted immediately when she realized I wasn't responding with guilt or offers of assistance. Maya, I know I made mistakes, but I was manipulated too. Brad convinced me that spending your money was the right thing to do, that it would help our whole family. I see now that he was using me to get access to your savings, but at the time I thought I was making smart investments. The deflection was masterful, acknowledging mistakes while attributing responsibility to Brad, claiming victimhood while avoiding accountability, suggesting that understanding her manipulation should lead to forgiveness without requiring actual change. She was using the same script that had worked for years, assuming that explaining her motivations would automatically restore my willingness to provide support. I understand that Brad influenced your decisions, I said, maintaining my calm tone despite the familiar frustration rising in my chest. But the choice to spend money that wasn't yours, without permission from the person who earned it, was ultimately your decision. Taking responsibility for that choice would be the first step toward rebuilding trust. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Mom had called expecting emotional reconciliation, immediate forgiveness, and resumed access to my resources and achievements. Instead, she was encountering accountability requirements that she wasn't prepared to meet. The daughter she remembered would have accepted her victim narrative and prioritized family harmony over personal boundaries. When she spoke again, her voice carried the frustrated edge of someone whose manipulation tactics were failing to produce desired results. I can't believe how hard and unforgiving you've become, Maya. The daughter I raised would never treat her mother this way. Military service changed you into someone I don't recognize. That accusation might have devastated me 2 years ago, but now it felt like confirmation that I was moving in the right direction. The daughter she remembered was someone who had been trained to absorb other people's problems and poor decisions without complaint, someone whose value was measured by her willingness to sacrifice her own well-being for other people's comfort. You're right that I've changed, I replied quietly. I've learned to value myself enough to maintain boundaries with people who have proven themselves willing to exploit my trust and resources. If that makes me unrecognizable to you, then maybe the relationship you're mourning was never healthy to begin with. The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there, with Mom cycling through the familiar patterns of guilt, anger, and emotional blackmail that had once guaranteed my compliance. She accused me of being selfish for pursuing my education instead, of helping family members in need. She claimed that my success was partially due to opportunities she had provided, making my independence a form of ingratitude. She suggested that refusing to help her financially was a betrayal of everything she had taught me about family loyalty. Each escalation confirmed that she hadn't changed at all. She had simply waited for me to achieve enough success to be worth pursuing again. The fellowship wasn't something she wanted to celebrate with me. It was something she wanted to benefit from. My achievements weren't evidence of growth she wanted to support. They were resources she wanted to access. The call ended when I calmly explained that I was interested in building a relationship based on mutual respect and accountability, but that I wasn't available to resume my previous role as family problem solver and financial backup system. If she was interested in exploring a healthier dynamic, she could contact me again when she was ready to take responsibility for her choices without expecting immediate forgiveness or assistance. 6 months later, I was presenting my graduate research at the National Engineering Conference when I spotted a familiar face in the audience. Mom sat in the back row, quietly taking notes as I explained my breakthrough in solar energy grid optimization. She had driven 8 hours to attend, not to ask for anything, but simply to witness what her daughter had accomplished. After my presentation, she approached hesitantly. Maya, I wanted you to know that I've been in therapy since our last conversation. I'm finally understanding how my choices hurt you, and I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or money. I just wanted to see you succeed and tell you that I'm proud of who you've become. For the first time in years, her words felt genuine. No manipulation, no agenda, just a mother acknowledging her daughter's strength. I'm starting to rebuild my life the right way, she continued. I got a full-time job, moved into my own apartment, And I'm paying off my debts myself. I hope someday we can have coffee, but only when you're ready." She handed me a card with her new contact information and walked away, respecting my space in a way she never had before. That evening, I called her. We talked for an hour about my research, her therapy progress, and tentative plans for rebuilding. Trust slowly, on healthy terms. Sometimes the people who hurt us most can change, but only when they're forced to face consequences. My refusal to enable her taught her lessons that years of rescue attempts never could. We're taking it one conversation at a time, building something new from the ashes of what was broken. If this story inspired you to value yourself enough to set boundaries with toxic people in your life, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your future self will thank you for choosing your peace over other people's comfort.